Great film. And welcome to all of you to this panel, which is about WMD, whose moral responsibility. But we have news, as you all know, out of Geneva, perhaps the negotiators inspired by images like this. And I want to take advantage of the fact that we have such a wonderful international audience here today to get some reaction to what has happened in Geneva. Briefly, I'm Jean Meserve. I'm your moderator here today, former CNN, former ABC, currently with a couple of Homeland Security outfits in Washington. The first person I want to talk to is an Iranian who's right here, Siavush. Quickly, can you tell us briefly your reaction to what's happened in Geneva?
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm personally very excited by what's happened last night. I think it's a watershed event. I'm not a nuclear physicist, but my understanding is that this agreement prolongs Iran's path towards nuclear latency. At the same time, it enforces a stricter control regime and provides a modest set of sanctions relief which are going to boost the moderate camp inside Iran, which will be able to press on other issues. Of course, the devil now is in the details and in the final status agreement, but I can't find an antonym for Pandora's box, but I think that what happened last night opens up a whole range of possibilities which can transform the Middle East into a much better region. So I'm looking forward to see what happens next.
Very optimistic view of what's happened. Let's get a different sampling of opinion here. Dov Zakheim is here. He's a former Assistant Secretary of Defense. Undersecretary, sorry.
Thanks very much. My worry is not over the next 6 months. Prime Minister of Israel has already condemned this agreement, said it's a terrible agreement. 99% of the world outside Israel does not want the Israelis to go off and do anything. And we in America are terribly worried that if the Israelis did anything, regardless of whether we were involved or not, we're going to get blamed and dragged in. The problem, to me, is that the president has once again laid out another red line, and his track record with red lines is, shall we say, ambiguous. The red line this time is the 6 months. For the next 6 months, regardless of what the Israelis say, they're unlikely to do anything for the simple reason that, as we just heard, this thing could actually work out. What happens if either nothing more is achieved after the 6-month period, that is to say, there isn't an agreement, or Iran cheats and nobody does anything about it, or one of the signatories or somebody else breaks the sanctions and nothing is done about that? If any of those three things happen, I believe Netanyahu will order an attack. And the reason he will is the same reason that Iran has been so difficult to deal with, in my view. They are both not irrational, but irrational. No prime minister of Israel wants to see his country destroyed on his watch and is not going to take the risk. I was told by their defense minister, anything above a 0 probability of an attack is too high a probability. And that's because of the Holocaust. And oh, by the way, the Iranians have already said that the Zionists have been defeated by this agreement. That doesn't help matters. But on the Iranian side, this is a civilization that's 3,000 years old. America wasn't a dream in anybody's eye when Persia was a great power. And they don't want to be pushed around. That is a lethal combination. And so if nothing gets done beyond these 6 months, I really worry.
We have some Israelis here, but I'm not picking you out in the room. Are you in here?
I think she left.
Oh, she snuck out. Okay. Gal was also here. There you are. Just to get the Israeli perspective as well. Let me jump back here. Briefly.
I don't know if I have an Israeli perspective. I have my own perspective, which is a little bit different from Dov's. I think what we've seen is the end of the military option for Israel. And I don't think that under those conditions Israel will go for a military action. I think that what we will see is a shift of the center of gravity from Jerusalem to Riyadh. because Israel only had military option. The Saudis have military as well as economic options. We will see homemade Saudi sanction regime played into global oil markets. Iranians need $140 a barrel to balance their budget. The Saudis need only $94 a barrel to balance their budget. They can play. They have cash reserves. So I think look into what's happening at OPEC. Look into who's going to be the next Secretary General of OPEC. There are going to be very interesting things happening in the world oil market, and that will have direct impact on the overall global economy.
Great. Let me now introduce our panelists to you and get them to weigh in on what all of this means. Let me start with Kurt Volker here on the end of the panel. Kurt's Executive Director of the McCain Institute for International Leadership. Camille Grand is also with us. He is Director of the Foundation for Strategic Research in Paris. We have Andrew Morrison, who is the Minister for International Security in the UK Ministry of Defense. And we have Hussein Haqqani, who is the former Pakistani ambassador to the U.S. and also a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. Thank you all for joining us here today. So President Obama says this opens the door to a more secure world, and yet you do have Prime Minister Netanyahu saying exactly the opposite, that this makes the world less safe. Your opinions?
I think the baby's been born. We have to wait to see how it turns out when it grows up. My own view is that based on what happened in case of India and Pakistan, that if a nation is determined enough to get weapons of mass destruction, it does. And so the question is, is this deal enough of an incentive for everybody in Iran, including the hardliners, to completely forego the nuclear option? The 4 countries that gave up nuclear weapons forever, South Africa, South Korea, Argentina, and Brazil, they were counting on totally different incentives and totally different way of calculating their national prestige. I think that we will see not only Iran have a great debate within itself, but the Arab world too will have a huge debate. And everybody's talking only about the Israelis, but the Arabs are not very happy this morning either.
Kurt?
Well, I have to say I'm a little bit more cautious than that. I think that the first thing we have to remember is the context here. What were we trying to do? We're trying to get Iran to stop progress towards a nuclear weapon and reverse that. And we put in place a whole bunch of sanctions in order to convince them to do that. What this agreement now does is it allows Iran, having pursued that progress over a decade now towards a nuclear weapon, to freeze in place while we lift some of the sanctions that were put in place to get them to reverse. So we kind of have moved ourselves without really getting the Iranians to go back. So that's one concern that I have. The second concern that I have is that we haven't seen the text. Maybe it's better than what we've been briefed on. But what we do know is that the only things that are covered by this are what's in the text itself. So, and that refers to the 20% being, eliminated or reprocessed downward. But it keeps the 3.5% enrichment going, so it's like the engine's still running on the car. Everything at Arak can continue except for the reactor. All work on a missile program and on any other type of weaponization can continue except for the enrichment part. So there's a lot of misdirection here by getting us focused on this without seeing the whole thing. The final point I want to make, and this, I first off want to say thank you to Peter MacKay and Minister Nicholson and Peter van Praag. This has been the best Halifax forum ever, one of the best conferences like this ever. And I also think they get the Academy Award for the best use of video.
Definitely, definitely.
And I think that deserves an applause as well.
That was
the video we just saw.
Steve Markle is the filmmaker, by the way.
Excellent
Those of you
job.
who will see his name in the Academy Awards in years to come.
Excellent job. What that video showed us very powerfully is, first off, weapons of mass destruction are truly horrible. And we do not want to take them lightly or live in a world where they proliferate easily. But the second thing it showed us, especially with that image of that little girl, is that the only thing worse than weapons of mass destruction is people who are willing to use them. And that's what we have in Syria, and that's why we are worried about Iran. And as much as we all hope that we can stop the progress toward WMD peacefully, I think we have to be really worried if what we're doing is freezing in place a capacity while other development goes on.
Camille, what do you say to those who say that we have not extracted enough from the Iranians for this deal?
I think we've extracted more than what was likely to happen a week or 10 days ago. So we've achieved a little bit by putting pressure, and I'm quite happy that we've done better than expected on Iraq in particular, which is a very important and critical issue. I think we need to be very cold-minded when looking at this. It is an interim agreement. It's not a final agreement, which is substantive but not historic. I think that's important. And it's the beginning of a process, not so much the end of a process. I think there is a bit too much of a celebration in various capitals, including Washington, on the sort of historic nature of the agreement. I think it's a very important agreement, but it's a stepping stone towards something else, and that something else is undefined yet. Are the Iranians ready to accept the sort of intrusive inspection regime that will create trust and reassurance? And to trust, we need to verify. Have the Iranians really taken the strategic decision to abandon their nuclear ambitions? I'm not sure of that. There may be plenty of people in Tehran that still think they can sort of finesse the international community around with that deal, that they are gaining time, that they are preparing for the next round and they are playing a blaming game on this. We don't know anything of this, and we will see how it unfolds. At the moment, and with the information available, which is still a White House fact sheet, we haven't seen the deal, at least I haven't, I think we can be reasonably happy with the fact that the deal is precise and substantive, but we should see it as it is, that is an interim agreement that allows a real negotiation to start, when till now we had a negotiation about negotiation.
Minister Morrison?
I share the optimism that has been expressed across the world, but I am an optimist by nature. I suspect we're going to come on to talk about Syria in due course, but again, we see there the prospect of the beginning of a process that will have an outcome that we would all want to see. This is quite limited. It's time-bounded and it's modest. And at the end of the process, if it has not proceeded to a position where we can take the next step, I think Iran will look pretty bad. And I think we have to accept that Iran is an ancient country that demands and warrants respect. And it wants to see it being dealt with in a commensurate way by the international community. It wants to see a way forward that it can take its proper part in the international community. And I believe that this may be the first step along that pathway. I'm not quite sure what the alternative is, to be honest with you. We have to, I think, ease sanctions, which have had quite a substantial effect on Iran as a token of our willingness to progress with this. But at the end of the 6 months, if nothing has happened, I think it will reflect as badly on Iran as it will on the international community that's trying to move this process along.
So how does it affect Saudi Arabia?
Well, I think that the Saudis are definitely concerned about Iran trying to impose a Pax Iranica or Pax Persiaca on the Gulf. And the Saudis are definitely concerned. The Saudis will...
Will they build?
I don't think the Saudis will build a nuclear weapon, but the Saudis will definitely look for nuclear options. And what those options might be, there's been a lot of speculation about it, but it does have ramifications for the entire region. It can't just be a deal between Iran and the P5. In fact, one of the things I'm concerned about is that especially the Americans have not been taking the Saudis and other Arab countries as much into confidence as they should have throughout this process. And just one thing about, without sounding the pessimist on the panel, let me say that the nature of regime is important to consider in relation to weapons of mass destruction. I'm sure that Hafiz Assad also wants to look, Hafiz Assad's son, Bashar Assad, also wants to look good. But he doesn't care about looking good when it's about his regime survival, and he uses chemical weapons. And I think there are people in Iran's regime also who have a similar attitude. Yeah. And unfortunately, similar people exist throughout that region where looking good is only part of the desire of leaders. Wielding control and being in charge is far more important to them.
All right. There's two other issues that are worth bringing up here. One of them is what Ambassador Haqqani is referring to, which is the issue of legitimacy. By concluding it this way without achieving the goals of reversing the program, we're legitimizing Iran now as the interlocutor to negotiate over where we go from here, meaning that the enrichment continues at the 3.5% level, and we're talking with them about what happens next. So we've given the people that Ambassador Haqqani is referring to a kind of foothold to say, okay, where do we go from here? And related to that is the issue of momentum. We had momentum coming up to this point where Iran was responding to pressure from the international community to do something. What I think they're trying to do with this agreement, that is an interim agreement, it's not meant to be the final deal, is to blunt the momentum, shift the dynamics, get some more time, and then see whether we're able to build that back up again.
And if it becomes a final agreement, then I think you and I will join the rank of the optimists.
Absolutely.
Camille, you want to weigh in?
I think we need to know what we gave. What we gave, and this is important, is enrichment on Iranian soil. Till now, UNSC resolutions were trying to reverse those activities. Some might say that was a realistic choice, with 19,000 centrifuges up and running in Iran to give away that. But that was, the strategic decision on our side was to say, okay, we will deal with that. In return for that, the Iranians are for the first time accepting to open debates on Iraq, which is being controlled, are reversing their 20% enrichment by diluting the existing stockpile, and are capping the enrichment program for the next 6 months. Are those the basis for a future deal? Technically, I guess that's what the negotiators would believe. But the problem is, at the moment, we can play the win-win situation. I'm not entirely sure that it's going to be feasible in 6 months from now, and especially when, as I hope, we will be requesting very intrusive measures to make sure that there are no clandestine activities, that facilities that have not been mentioned in the deal as it stands, such as the Parshin research facility, which is under military control, will they be open and fully open? All of these are the critical issues at the moment. So this is where we are testing the good faith of the Iranians in terms of do they agree that they are capping their nuclear ambitions. If they don't really want to do it, it will show in the next few months.
I'm going to shake up the format a little bit here. I'd love to take some questions from the audience about this subject. If you can keep them short and sweet, that would be great so we can get more of them in. We have many other topics to discuss, but this is so hot right now. I want to seize the opportunity, and right here we have someone raising their hand.
Thank you very much. Josh Rogan, Daily Beast, Washington, D.C. I think very quickly what's shaping up to be the fault line in the debate over this in Washington is whether or not Iran will ultimately retain a right to enrich, right? So last night on a conference call very late with a senior White House official whose name may or may not rhyme with Ken Rhodes, this White House official said, we do not acknowledge Iran's right to enrich, right? It was very, very clear, and that's what everybody wrote last night. Well, today we actually did obtain a copy of the agreement, and I'm quoting from it right now, making a little news with you guys. The agreement would involve a mutually defined enrichment program with practical limits and transparency measures to ensure the peaceful nature of the program. So the White House is correct in that we're not acknowledging the right to enrich today, but in 6 months we very well could. So my question for our experts here is that an end state that the the international community can accept. If the P5+1 countries are prepared to allow Iran to maintain whatever it is, the breakout capacity that remains with a limited right to enrich, is that something that everyone in this room can be cool with, or will we see a situation where in 6 months the preponderance of the opinion will be that no, enrichment right is not okay, and then that will be the situation under which the deal breaks down? Thank you.
Kurt?
Yeah, thanks. Josh, you make a really important point. Remember what the Iranians have said going into and after this agreement. They don't need to have a right to enrichment written down in a text because they feel they have the right. It's a natural right of every country to be able to do this. And so there's no reason for that to be written down, and that's what they maintain. Combine that with the fact that the agreement now includes the fact that there is enrichment on Iranian soil, and I think that concedes the Iranian point. That's basically what Camille was just saying. I think that's tremendously significant. Your question, is it good or are we comfortable with it? I personally am not comfortable with it because of every pattern and every experience we've had with Iran on talking about this nuclear program or on everything else that they do in the world as a matter of government policy. I'm not comfortable with them continuing enrichment so that we say this is extending the period, the breakout is further down the road. But if in fact they work on other areas of a weaponization program and keep the cylinders running, it may in fact shorten the time that they would need at the end of the day to actually become a nuclear state.
Camille?
A very quick point on the issue of enrichment. A right to enrichment does not exist anywhere. It's a creation by the Iranians in the debate. There is a right to peaceful use under Article 4 of the NPT. There is no such thing as a right to enrichment or a right to reprocessing. So their demand was a bizarre demand in the sense that there's no such thing as a right to enrich. But now we are facing with a situation where we tolerate enrichment on Iranian soil with the consequences. Second point is that the current program as it stands is a bit inconsistent. It's inconsistent with a research program because you don't need 19,000 centrifuges to do research. And it's inconsistent with a civilian program because if you actually want to fuel Bushehr, and if the Russians allow that you fuel Bushehr with fuel rods coming from the Iranian centrifuge program, you would need far more centrifuge. You would need probably 50,000 instead of 19,000. So we are in a sort of in-between situation there that is making things extraordinarily complicated. It will be, in a way, the diplomats have finessed the issue because we didn't recognize the right that, in fact, the Iranians were not really asking for, as Kurt was saying.
But let me just say that why do they need enrichment? Why does anyone need enrichment? And why insist on a right to enrichment? It's actually a way to be able to say that we actually have a right to enrich independently and then not be restricted by what purpose we will put that fuel to use. And that is an important point. The Iranians are not unsmart. They are actually paving the way for a subsequent argument, which, by the way, does make sense to a lot of people like me who come from other countries, that those countries who have themselves used nuclear weapons in the past are not the ones to tell the whole world that they shouldn't have nuclear weapons. That said, I think this right to enrichment is essentially connected to their subsequent argument that I see coming down the road, that they have a right to have nuclear weapons unless and until everybody revokes them. The problem is, unlike India, Pakistan, and Israel, who were not signatories to the NPT, the Iranians are signatories to the NPT, and therefore they would be in violation thereof. But when has the likelihood of being held liable or responsible for violating a treaty ever stopped a totalitarian regime from behaving badly?
Minister Merson?
Well, I think a lot of us struggle with the notion that a country that has such rich natural resources necessarily needs to have a civil nuclear capability. That said, clearly, it is Iran's right, I think, in a general sense, to have a Pacific nuclear capability for civil purposes. And I speak as somebody who's from a country which has just restarted its nuclear energy plans with Hinkley C and plans to, with our French partners, develop a civil nuclear capability to replace the one that's currently aging. So I think many of us will be in a very difficult position if we were to insist that Iran should stop its program aimed at civil nuclear power. That would be a remarkable thing. And I think probably the reaction from Iran would be predictable. It would be something I think that the Iranian leadership would have great difficulty selling to its population. Obviously, there'd be massive loss of face were such a thing to be attempted. So I have to say we have to work with the art of the possible, whilst of course retaining that general scepticism that I touched on first of all about why it is that Iran should really need this particular capability.
Well, I think Iran should have the right to peaceful nuclear energy, but does a so-called right to enrichment really is that necessary for having peaceful nuclear energy? So many countries in the world have it without their own enrichment facilities. And the fact that Iran insists on having that enrichment facility gives me some pause for worry.
Exactly.
And here's the man who always gets to ask a question for you.
Thank you. Peter McKay. And I'm glad that Halifax is living up to its reputation for being such an incubator for insightful discussion and ideas. I want to move a little bit away from the whole discussion around enrichment, the details, will it stand the test of time, and step back to the question of who are we speaking to and do they really speak for Iran? We saw Rouhani's charm offensive at the UN. We know that on closer examination, he himself has a little bit of a spotty past, but it's really Khomeini who is ultimately going to be the decision maker here. And in the last 48 hours, we've seen images of him standing before fanatics, death to the West, the usual rhetoric. So I guess, as in all deals, is there a trust factor here that we need to delve a little deeper into? And does Rouhani even have the mandate to really carry through whatever those details and those promises might be?
I'll give you my take on that. I think, yes, we are. We have plenty of reasons not to trust the Iranian leadership. They've proved in the past that they were ready to conduct a variety of very unacceptable behavior in a wide range of regions and so on. And that's one of the reasons the French were so distrustful of them, because we do remember terrorism in the 1980s, including in France, sponsored by Iran and so on. And Khamenei was already in place. So we should keep that in mind. Having said this, I think Rouhani had a mandate to achieve that. And contrary to what he says, it was not so much a popular mandate to lift the sanction by vote, but a mandate by Ali Khamenei to say, get us out, untie a bit the sanctions knots that is biting, and we need room. And there was my sense is there is a sort of a deal at the moment, a quid pro quo in the Iranian system, because on the one hand, Rouhani and Zarif that have a mandate to open up talks with the West, primarily on the nuclear deal, and get a little air for the regime. And on the other hand, Soleimani and others that handle the Syrian file, so sponsor Assad and help him, and keep the regime in place. So don't open up to the true reformists that are still under house arrest and so on. So you see that tension within the system with a quid pro quo inside the system at the moment, which is let's give up a little bit on the nuclear front, but within the regime, let's the hardliners keep Syria and keep the Islamic revolution spirit against the reformists. So that's a bit, I think, the quid pro quo I feel is happening at the moment, which is favorable to the nuclear side of the deal because he has mandate to be flexible. But we'll see how far it goes.
We have another question back here. If you could stand up, please.
Paul Dewar, Member of Parliament from Ottawa and Vice Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee. I want to build on the Minister's comments because there's trust, and of course the other piece of that saying as I go is verification. And I'd be interested just to build on what we've just heard on verification. What we've heard last night was that this is interim. Everyone's going to be vigilant for 6 months. We're going to, all be watching. And the Iranians, I think I agree, it's in their best interest to play ball. But if it's going to be comprehensive, then we have to have long-term verification. What does that look like, and who will actually do that? And I'd be interested to hear from our panel on that.
Do we have an answer?
Yeah, I'd like to combine these two because I'm thinking much along the same lines. First off, I think a lot too much is made of trust because it's actually what you agree to and what people do. And if they do it and you can verify it, you're happy. And if not, then the next step is consequences. What are the consequences if people fail to live up to it? It's not about trust. It's about what do you agree and what happens. And that's where I think perhaps the Iranians maybe understand diplomacy a little bit better than we do. They have a goal set by Khamenei that is then implemented through diplomacy to try to achieve that goal. The goal being get the sanctions relief and keep the nuclear program as best you can. And they've done well at that. Our goal in using diplomacy seems to have been to reach an agreement rather than to get rid of the nuclear program. And I think that that's where maybe they have actually got this round going. And the key question then is what happens after that? If we move from the first agreement to a more permanent arrangement, what are the mechanisms that are put in place for verification so we know exactly what's happening? Is the content of the agreement actually solid? And what are the consequences if it's violated?
I would also pay attention to what the Iranian people are told, because sometimes I've noticed that there is a tendency, I've noticed that in Washington, I've noticed that in London, to assume that certain things that are being said for domestic purposes are just for domestic purposes. But what you tell your own people is essentially what your basic frame of reference is. So if the Iranian people are told, we've had a great victory, and this means our nuclear program will endure, then obviously that's a totally different formulation and a totally different argument from saying we've reached a compromise, and this compromise is we've given some things up and they have agreed to lift sanctions as a result. Let's wait to see how this is played in the Iranian media and to the Iranian people.
On verification per se, and specifically on what I would, out of any government, suggest to have on Iran, and this is going to be a very difficult take. The Iranians are going to say, we go back to standard IAEA procedures. We're already doing that. We do it a little more. Maybe we go to the what's called the enhanced safeguards, so a little more IAEA presence in the country. My expert advice would be to say we need far more than that, because we need to rebuild confidence. And for that, after 10 years of discussions, after 20 years of cheating with IAEA rules, the international community can respectfully request access, full-time, anytime, anywhere access in Iran for an interim period of time during which trust will be reestablished. This is a very complicated thing to achieve. Unfortunately, we won't probably have that much of access, but we need to get as close as possible to that, because it is the Iranian responsibility to demonstrate their commitment. And for that, the best way they can do is open the facilities and allow international IAEA access anytime, anywhere, so that confidence is being rebuilt. And then, of course, in the best of all worlds, in the best scenario, in 5-10 years from now, we will move back to more standard inspection regime.
But the prospects of that happening are quite slim.
Again, it's their good faith. I mean, that's going to be tested.
But is it just a technical issue, or is it also a political issue? I mean, the political issue is, does the Iranian regime, with all its various facets and factions, has it reached the conclusion that it's not in its interest to have nuclear weapons like South Korea concluded or South Africa did? And if that conclusion has not been reached, then we will continue to have the same game that we've had in the past, perhaps with some more Western presence and some more intrusive inspections.
Yeah. Well, look, the process has been already thrashed out. That's the basis of the Geneva Agreement that has been
for 6 months
reached. Yeah, indeed, absolutely. So I don't think it's reasonable to extend beyond that. Clearly, over the next 6 months, that's not going to happen. And I think to simply open up all the facilities to inspection of the way that's been described would result in a huge loss of face in Iran, and that's just not possible. We have to work with what we have got. and be realistic. So I think what's been thrashed out is the best possible outcome, frankly. It is fairly extensive. Of course, it's within our IAEA framework. I think there's no other way of doing this. And we will have to see in 6 months' time whether that can be extended in any way, shape, or form. But I think we have to be practical and realistic about what the Iranian regime, for all the reasons I previously described in terms of loss of face, are prepared to accept. And I think there's a degree of management expectation management necessary in this.
There's another question up here. Yes.
From Germany. I would like to ask a question about leading by example, and now here I come to other official nuclear weapon countries. Every time something like that happens, moving on the NPT front, whether it's a country breaking out or a country giving away his rights or its capabilities, we have the discussion whether the big nuclear powers shouldn't have an initiative for disarmament or reduction of arms. Would that help if in the next months we would see a new initiative, and which countries should take part in that? The Obama administration, together with Russia, has already a record on that, but here also comes a question to Great Britain and France. And would that be helpful, or is that just symbolic and not of any help?
Minister Merchant.
I think that puts me on the spot, doesn't it?
It does a bit.
The Non-Proliferation Treaty is pretty clear, and Britain is compliant with that. We do have a continuous at-sea nuclear deterrent, and our successor programme will be compliant in respect of it reducing the amount, the payload available quite substantially. So I'm very pleased and proud of the line that the UK has taken with this. And in terms of others learning from our example, it would be very pleasing if others moved in that direction. Of course, Britain isn't in the position tomorrow of declaring that we're not going to have this particular capability going forward. Of course, it would be very nice for us all to work towards that end. And indeed, that is the intention of the treaty to which we are signatories. So I think, in short, we are most definitely compliant with our obligations, and I think obeying both the spirit and the letter of the law in that regard.
Now, what about France?
I'll be very blunt. I don't believe that our behavior on disarmament has any impact whatsoever on proliferation. The reality is, since the end of the Cold War, there has never been so much disarmament on the part of Russia and the United States, and the French arsenal has been divided by twos as the British arsenal, and it's in the exact same 20 years that we're seeing Iran, North Korea going nuclear, Pakistan and India testing. So our behavior on disarmament has no direct impact on that, which doesn't mean that we shouldn't do anything about it. We need to demonstrate that we move in good faith towards more nuclear disarmament according to Article 6. But that's more a deal with the good guys, not so much a deal with the bad guys, because they don't take that into account. What they look into is their security calculus, and honestly, I've never heard any Iranian or North Korean wondering whether if France had 200 instead of 300, that would change their decision. That doesn't. What we need to do is try to create the condition for further nuclear disarmament, and for me, one of the first conditions for that is a robust non-proliferation regime.
Camille, in the meantime, Pakistan is building it.
And India and Pakistan, of course, first of all, we both resent being described as the bad guys.
No.
And on that point, we can definitely unite. But look, India's argument for going nuclear always was that it does not accept nuclear apartheid. It doesn't accept the fact that only 5 nations are allowed to have nuclear weapons, and the 6th one, which was India itself, is not. Pakistan's argument was, well, if India is going to have it, then we'll have it as well. My point being that the overall international regime for nuclear restraint is not necessarily working as well as the Honourable Minister just now said. There is an inherent flaw in it. India, Pakistan and Israel stayed out of the NPT, and Two of them have demonstrated their nuclear weapons capability. The third one is assumed to have nuclear capability. If we are going to talk about weapons of mass destruction, we shouldn't keep the discussion only about Iran or, for that matter, Syria and North Korea. Yes, the nature of the regime matters a lot, but the fact of the matter remains that there has to be some universality in global attitudes towards eliminating weapons of mass destruction. And unless and until that debate is started, many nations will continue to pursue weapons of mass destruction as weapons of national pride. And then if we are going to say that Iran should be allowed to save face by not being told to have very intrusive inspections, well, guess what? Saudi Arabia has its face as well, because it is the preeminent Arab nation of the world, and there is a whole historic rivalry between Arab and Ajam, which the Arabs would definitely invoke at this point. So my point is that to just say, well, those of us who have it, well, we are doing what we can, we've reduced the numbers, but it's not going to change anything for the others, is not necessarily correct, because people do make the argument that there is a dichotomy, there is a duality in the approach towards weapons of mass destruction between those countries who already have them and then try to tell others not to have them. There should be some effort to create universality on this issue.
But Hussein, I think a point that you made earlier is the fundamental point, which is the nature of the regime, the nature of the government that we're talking about. No one is worried that French or British or American nuclear weapons are going to be used, or they're going to be used in a coercive, threatening way to achieve some goal. That's not the
I'm not
issue.
disputing that.
No, I know. But I think that is critical, because that is exactly why we do worry about a country like North Korea or Iran acquiring nuclear weapons. So I'm actually quite pleased that we live in a world where stable democracies that care about human rights and the rule of law and security do have nuclear weapons as a deterrent. And I'm concerned about two things on the nuclear front. One of them is the proliferation to regimes that are of great concern because of the choices that they would make. And secondly, just the vast number of Russian tactical nuclear weapons that have never been addressed. Those I think, are the two real nuclear problems in the world.
Minister, did you want to weigh in?
Yes, I mean, the question was really one to do with setting a good example, if I understood it correctly. And, of course, the exam question that's been set in this session is around morality. I think, actually, we do have a duty, those of us that are signatories to the treaty, to reduce our armamentarium. And that's what the UK is doing. It is right to say that other states, and I certainly wouldn't regard Pakistan or India as the bad guys. Of course I wouldn't. It is perfectly legitimate for those countries to say to those of us who are campaigning on this front, well, what are you doing about this then? I think that's perfectly reasonable. And I think it would be very difficult for us to do so if we weren't demonstrating that we ourselves were trying to address this particular form of weaponry.
What troubles me in that discussion is that it seems that non-proliferation is only in the interest of the established nuclear weapon states. This is not the case. This is in the interest of 183 non-nuclear states that have signed up to the NPT in good faith and that have no interest in seeing their neighbor going nuclear for that. So I think in a way and that was very interesting in the title, in the moral dilemma thing, it seems to me a bit awkward sometimes that the non-proliferation debate seems to be a debate between the P5 and the proliferator. And that has to do with the format of negotiation, P5 plus 1, the 3 plus 3. You bring in some non-nuclear countries, but I think it should be very important to bring more on board those non-nuclear countries that pay attention to international security, and I would say non-Western, non-nuclear countries, because countries like Canada and many Europeans have a very good record of advocating non-proliferation, but that it is in their interest. The Iranian nuclear program, in a way, if you see it from a purely nuclear weapon state perspective, you can say, we'll deter them ultimately. If you are a non-nuclear country in the region or beyond, it becomes a critical strategic change. So I think we need to, that's the beauty of the NPT. The NPT is not a disarmament and non-proliferation agreement alone. It's also a security agreement, a security treaty that provides security to all these countries that sign up for it.
We have another question back here.
Ayman Mhanna from Lebanon, a country where Iran has a very significant regional actor, Hezbollah, or asset. Also, Hezbollah being the most powerful political player in Lebanon, and where also Iran was targeted by an attack, or I mean the embassy was targeted by an attack last week. I want to look at the Pax Iranica option. Is there in a hotel room, another hotel maybe, in Geneva, discussions about a Pax Iranica and what aspects of that Pax Iranica would be accepted by the international community in parallel to the agreement on the nuclear option? And to link the question back to the previous panel on, terrorist actions and the question from my Algerian friend on Gulf countries who are obviously not very happy with the developments of yesterday night, funding some extremist groups here and there, would, in addition to the economic reaction through oil prices, would there be a security reaction by more attacks similar to the ones we saw last week in Lebanon as a way of expressing discontent with what's happening in Geneva? Thank you.
Well, I just hope that this is not just about Iran's nuclear program and will be the beginning of some kind of a process that takes into consideration all of Iran's conduct and then the conduct of its so-called rivals as well. I mean, let's be honest, not all of them have clean hands. Nobody has clean hands in the Middle East. And so I hope that the P5 will go beyond just this agreement. And I'm not a skeptic or a pessimist on it. I just want to wait to see what the results are. But I do think that the nature of the Iranian regime is, does this mark the change in that? And if it doesn't, then we will have a dozen problems in the Middle East resulting from the nature of the Iranian regime and the nature of the rivals of Iran in the region.
This is a good point maybe to start bringing up the Syria question too, because we've been talking now for an hour about weapons of mass destruction, and it is tremendously important. We do have to deal with them. But we can't be mesmerized by dealing with weapons of mass destruction and fail to recognize all of the other things that are going on that we should care about. And in the case of Syria, for example, chemical weapons are responsible for the deaths of a couple of thousand people compared to 120,000 that have been killed and over 6 million refugees and displaced persons that this regime has inflicted. And they're doing that with the direct involvement of Hezbollah and Iran and with support from Russia. So we can't just focus only on the WMD question and miss a lot of this bigger picture as well, and that's true of Syria as well as Iran.
Minister Merston, I know you have some thoughts on this.
Well, I suppose I do. I share the abhorrence of everybody in the audience, the use of weapons of mass destruction. But I think we have to accept that far more death and destruction has been visited on human beings by conventional weapons over the years than have ever been caused by weapons of mass destruction. So I think we need to bottom out why it is we have a particular abhorrence for WMDs and why we feel it necessary to underpin those, rightly in my view, but nevertheless, by treaties and conventions. And I think the point was very well made. This development, if it's genuine, by Mr. Rouhani, is never going to just be around nuclear weapons. If it's genuine, it has to be played out throughout the whole piece. In other words, Iran's involvement with state-sponsored terrorism and regimes that are threatening all of us. Now, I'm an optimist, as I said earlier on, and I actually rather hope and believe there are grounds for optimism in this respect, but it's not just about nuclear.
I think we need to be very careful in not overburdening the process. If we start saying that this deal is the beginning of a solution to Iraq, a solution to Syria, a solution to Afghanistan, because now we're great friends with Iran and we're going to solve everything thanks to that deal, we're sure the whole thing will collapse at some point, because it might be. I mean, at the moment, I'm very skeptical on the the positive vibes that it will bring to other issues. I think at first sight it might create exactly what you were fearing, that is, more tensions about Syria, about in Lebanon, because there will be groups in the Iranian system, in the system of several Arab countries, that will be tempted to try to score back what they believe was a compromise. So that's going in the short term, that's going to be a problem. In the longer term, if the optimistic scenario prevails, yes, we can hope for the best and see positive outcome in the relationship of Iran with its neighbors and so on. But we are not quite there yet, and I'm afraid we are more in the situation. And lastly, I do tend to believe that WMD as such are something specific, and that we somehow a bit missed that in the management of the Syrian crisis, but that's another...
But let's be clear, the discussions we're having about WMD with either Syria or Iran are not at the moment leading to broader discussion about what to do about Syria and Iran. It's doing exactly the opposite. It's distracting us into these issues from everything else going on.
But if you're right, the process will fail, because to succeed, it must be underpinned by a general feeling in Iran that it wants to alter the course it has taken. The aim is still the same, and that is to be a significant regional player. And clearly, that's the aim. The question is whether it should be done through being an isolated state in the way that has sadly been the case for decades, or whether it wants to engage with normal rules of engagement that we would be accustomed to using as countries. And I believe there are grounds for supposing that the latter course is being tentatively taken by the regime rather than the former. But we'll know over the next 6 months, because if nothing happens, and if this process ends badly, it'll be translated across the piece, in my view, not just in relation to nuclear weapons, but all the things we're now discussing. And Iran will be in an increasingly isolated and unhappy place, in my view.
I wanted to touch back to Syria for just a moment. So we have chemical weapons being removed from Syria. Apparently, deadlines are being met and will be met. However, no consequences for Assad. What message is that sending to other bad actors around the world?
I think the principal message that Assad and others take away from this is you can use force to stay in power. Doesn't matter how many people
including
you kill.
WMD.
Well, including WMD, because that then becomes a bargaining chip that gets you the legitimacy for others to deal with you to stay in power. So I think the lesson is don't do what others did in the Middle East Arab Spring revolutions of trying to accommodate your opposition, trying to find a way forward, and you get overthrown. Actually, work with the Iranians, work with the Russians, get outside support, and fight and kill, and that will keep you in power.
Any disagreement on that, Camille?
With Assad, we see something very new. We all expected, and we've been studying in our war games and tabletops, the notion that the WMD would be used to preserve regime survival. And there would be a blackmail. So how do we deter the sort of deterrence a regime would use to say, if you go after me, I will do something terrible with my WMD. In this case, we didn't have a game of deterrence. We had a game of use by the regime, which prompted regime survival. So it's a very a new thing that we need to think through. The fact that giving up WMD allows regime survival, at least momentarily. Having said this, the technicalities of the deal are working well. The OPCW is doing a good job on the ground, and as long as Assad believes it's in his interest to give up the weapons, it's going to move forward, and hopefully within the time frame, and then we will have gotten rid of these chemical weapons.
Well, from my rather Anglo perspective, this sort of process began early in August, where we had a vote on whether we should take action in Syria in the House of Commons, and the answer was no. At that particular point. Thereafter, things seemed to happen really, really rather fast. And when the history books come to be written about this, again, perhaps my optimism is being revealed. Perhaps we might have seen that as the start of the process in this. Because by the 14th of September, of course, we had an agreement with Resolution 2118, which appears to have been being rolled out in really quite a remarkable way. The deadlines have been met, the thing's on course, The means of producing these substances have been destroyed, and whilst, of course, we have to wait till the middle of next year to see whether it comes to its ultimate conclusion, there are real grounds for optimism about this. And I'm hopeful that by the middle of next year, we will have a great example of diplomacy and dialogue actually working for once, which perhaps will be helpful in other areas. But so far, I think, despite the pessimism that's been expressed by my fellow panelists...
But the slaughter continues.
Of course it does. And it's not to downplay in any way the significance of that. But the intent was to remove this weapon of mass destruction. And so far, that process is proceeding. And it sort of touches upon the points that were made earlier about the moral equivalence, if you like, of chemical weapons and other forms of harming people. That's something perhaps for the moral philosophers to debate, and we're not going to sort it out today, that's for sure. But the intent of the international community was fairly specific, and that was the removal of this particular piece of weaponry. At the moment, from where we are at the moment, that process appears to be going well.
But if this is about morality, so you had hundreds killed by chemical weapons, you've done something about that issue, but the world does nothing about the continuing murder going on in Syria, about the refugee crisis. Is that a moral stance that's justifiable?
Well, I think if you've been distracted by focusing on one particular piece of weaponry at the exclusion of dealing with other things, you've got a bit of a problem. But, we've ignored chemical weapons in the past and done nothing, and we've had the awful consequences of that. On this occasion, we have reacted to that. We are dealing with it, and I don't think, although we're all right to be sceptical, we should downplay the significance of what is happening.
We have a question right here. Yes.
Thank you very much. This has been and is a fascinating panel. I'm Cesar Jaramillo with Project Plowshares here in Canada. I have a question. Before I get to it, I must make a brief comment about the question my friend here made, and I must dispute the point that was made about minimizing the linkage between the failure to disarm and the risk of proliferation. And in fact, it's not my opinion. The case has been made repeatedly and compellingly that there is a clear linkage between the failure to disarm and the risk of proliferation. And in fact, the question about leading by example referred, the wording used was disarmament, not reductions, not reconfigurations, not management, not modernization to other optimal levels, but actual disarmament. So until that is achieved, there will inevitably be strong proliferation pressures. It's just a matter of fact. Secondly, the gentleman here, he said that nobody worries about France, the UK, or the US using their nuclear weapons. I think that needs to be qualified a little bit. I mean, a lot of, again, not me, authoritative scholars, researchers, former diplomats say there is a clear risk that their nuclear weapons can be used by accident, miscalculation, or design. So I think that such an argument sends a bit of a dangerous message that says that norms about weapons of mass destruction focus not on the possession of the weapon, but on the actor. And the net result is that there cannot be a clear answer to basic questions such as, is it acceptable for a state to possess nuclear weapons? The only answer we're left at this point is, it depends. Are you Israel or are you Iran? Are you North Korea or are you the United States? That was my brief comment. The question is, I very much appreciated Mr. McKay's comment earlier about the importance of considering domestic political considerations in Iran and whether it's Rouhani who has the real power or not, who we're talking to. I would like to flip that and draw attention to domestic political considerations in the West. And the question here has often been asked, what's going to happen in 6 months on Iran's end? Will they be able to deliver? The opposite side of the equation is, will we, or the U.S., for example, be able to deliver and provide some sanctions relief? Right now, they have been temporarily and partially frozen. However, and a lot is said about the sanctions and about freezing them and how stringent they have been, but I'm not sure that everybody knows what the sanctions really are and what it would take to lift them. The United States president, to lift them, will have to certify to Congress that Iran has released all political prisoners and detainees, ceased practices of violence and abuse, conducted a transparent investigation into the killing of peaceful political activists, established an independent judiciary, etc., etc.
Okay, let's try and get an answer here because we've got limited time left. Who wants to jump in?
I'm not sure I can answer much of that, really, but what I would just observe is perhaps taking a slightly contrary view over nuclear weapons. It is perfectly legitimate to consider the part that nuclear weapons have played in avoiding a conventional war. And clearly that lies at the very heart of the whole philosophy and the strategic concept of NATO, for example. We haven't had a Third World War, thank God. And it would be clearly wrong not to consider the part that nuclear weapons have played in preventing such a thing happening. And it comes back to the point that we were discussing earlier about the relative morality of high explosives, in this case, and nuclear weapons. You know, dead really is dead. And it doesn't necessarily matter what means have been used to procure that end. And the moral question is surely the prevention of war. That's the underlying moral question, rather than the specifics of weapons of mass destruction.
So are you saying disarmament is a bad idea?
No, I'm saying disarmament is a good idea, but disarmament in the round. And I'm suggesting to you that one specific form of weaponry isn't the point in case. It is the whole of it. And we have to consider what part nuclear weapons, of course Britain has some, has played in preventing a conflagration of the sort we saw twice in the last century.
Kurt, do you want to make a quick
I'll
comment?
just two simple points. I don't for a minute believe that countries such as North Korea or Iran would stop seeking nuclear weapons if France, the UK, and the US had zero. And secondly, I don't believe the world would be safer if the US engaged in unilateral nuclear disarmament.
We have another question here.
Yeah, I think we're in agreement there.
The topic we were set here is weapons of mass destruction, whose responsibility. North Korea has been mentioned 3 times in the last hour or so, and that's fine because the news overnight has been Iran. And it's legitimately a global question, it's legitimately a transatlantic question as well. My question to the panel is, how do you think this agreement will be read in Pyongyang? Because there is, in North Korea you have a regime which has conducted 3 underground nuclear tests. In North Korea, you have a regime which has already conducted a range of medium to long-range missile tests, some more successful than the Western community would have anticipated. So in the overall scheme of things, if we are looking at WMD in terms of global responsibilities, in the hemisphere we were discussing yesterday, both Iran and North Korea are highly relevant because missile trajectories actually affect both.
And North Korea has not responded to the...
My quick answer is that right now I think Kim Jong-un is actually looking for a North Korean Rouhani and a North Korean Zarif. And saying, you know what, we need somebody who can go out and convince the world that we have changed. And that's exactly what North Korea will try to do. The way they're reading it is, it's all about managing diplomacy. They're not reading it as a substantive change. That's my view from what I know of North Korea.
I would say that, I think the North Koreans will have a harder time in developing a Twitter diplomacy that the Rouhani has done. And, you know, I don't see Kim Jong-un turning into that sort of John Lennon figure that tweets all the time about give peace a chance and why don't we talk and things like that. So that's going to be a bit complicated for Kim Jong-un, who's more on the record for doing rather brutal comments and behavior. The second thing, more seriously, is one important and interesting element is how will it impact something which is a big untold story, which is and very hard to dig story, which is the connection between the 2 nuclear and missile programs. Hopefully, and I mean that would be one of my small expectations from Iran, is that they do less with North Korea, and that could help. Because that's a big question mark. I would leave it at this, on how much the 2 systems are intertwined in terms of nuclear research, ballistic research, and so on. So that's one thing that we need to be very careful about, and that could be a positive outcome of the Iranian deal, that the Iranians don't want to be seen supporting or being too closely associated with the North Koreans, because they would be afraid that it would be blamed on would be considered a non-compliance with the agreement if they are too much involved with the North Koreans. So that could be one slightly positive outcome. Finally, of course, for the 3+3 talks in the region, I think it's a bit corners the Chinese who've not been delivering that much on the North Korean front to maybe take a higher profile in moving things forward in the peninsula as well.
They have been a bit. The Chinese have stepped up a bit.
A little bit, but they've not delivered, to be honest.
Any other thoughts on North Korea? As one official said, that's the problem from hell. I want to thank our panel here today for this great discussion and very timely, and to our audience as well. Thanks to all of you. We did save the best for last, don't you think? Thank you all. And
I want to thank you, Gene, for joining us once again here in Halifax. It's great to have you here. I'm not going to keep people. I know you've got planes to catch. And so I do want us to say a few words, if that's okay with everybody, and thank so many people who made this possible. At the top of my list are Ministers Nicholson and McKay. Minister Nicholson, thank you so much for your time and for your commitment. It is great to have you here for the first time, and we're so happy that you hosted us here this weekend in Halifax. Thank you so much. Minister McKay, thank you so much for your leadership and your vision, and for bringing the world to your beautiful home here in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Thank you so much, Minister McKay. I want to thank Bill McCaffrey and Nancy Southern of the Halifax Canada Club. Without your support, together with the Government of Canada, we couldn't do what we do. So thank you so much. In American politics, every once in a while there's a slogan that goes like this: 4 more years. Here in Canada, thanks to the Government of Canada, thanks to the Halifax Canada Club, we're actually very proud to say 5 more years here in Halifax, Nova Scotia. I want to thank Joe Hall, Halifax International Security Forum Vice President, and everybody in our team, both in Canada and the United States. I want to thank my distinguished board of directors, both also Canada and the United States, for their support throughout the entire year in making this possible. And finally, I want to thank you, our panelists, throughout the weekend. You get special mention because you're the final panelists, but all of our panelists, all of our moderators, and to you, all of our participants who have traveled from 50 countries, 6 continents, to be here in Halifax, Nova Scotia. We look forward to having you back next year, and in the meantime, I hope that the things that you learned here and the partnerships and the friendships that you made will last you throughout the year. Thanks so much, and safe home, everybody. Bye.